Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to session 11, entitled Surficial Processes-Geomorphology, Chemical Weathering, Exposure Age Dating, and Permafrost Dynamics. This session is co-sponsored by SCAR ANTPAS, and the conveners are myself, Barry Lyons from the Ohio State University. I'm Melisa Diaz, who is here with me on her way to the University of Colorado in Boulder. Mauro, Guglielmin, and Marc, Oliva, and Dan Morgan, who's also with us from Vanderbilt University. He's presenting later in the session. So there's a number of housekeeping things we'll get to right away. The first one is if you have any questions, the way the session will go is the speakers will speak for approximately 10 minutes. We'll have 5 speakers, and then the questions, we'll have a 10-minute question and answer period after the first 5 speakers. And the questions need to be asked on the question and answer. There should be a question and answer window on the presentation on this Zoom call that you can ask questions. And then I guess what we'll do is Melisa and I will read the questions to the various speakers. So as the speaker speaks, jot down your question, put it on the question and answer box, and we'll get to it. The session's being recorded, just so everybody realizes that. And anyway, we look forward to a very interesting session. There's a lot of really diverse talks, and we'll start by introducing the first speaker, who is Yogesh Ray. He's from the National Center for Ocean and Polar Research in India, and he's talking about glacier landforms and quantification of past glacier movements in the Schumacher Oasis in East Antarctica. Take it away.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and namaskar from India. Myself, Yogesh Ray, and I work at National Center for Polar and Ocean Research. And today I'm going to present our findings from Schumacher Oasis in East Antarctica. So basically, I'm talking about the glacial landforms and quantification of past glacial movements in Schumacher Oasis. So Schumacher Oasis, which is situated in the central Groningen Moorland in East Antarctica, is part of the isolated chain of ice-free hills present across the Antarctic coastline. It is dominated by a decametric scale undulating topography, situated in between latitude 70° 43 minutes to 70° 48 south and longitude 11° 20 minutes to 11:55 east. The landscape comprises numerous small hills with east-west trend. The eastern and western end of the oasis is low-lying, 5 to 10 meter in elevation, whereas the maximum 227 meter is in the central part of the oasis. Overall, roughly it has an area of approximately 32 square kilometers. And as you can see, this is the marginal area between the continental ice sheet and the ice shelf. Coming on to the geomorphology and structures, the major tectonic divisions of Schumacher oasis are kilometer scale white faults, which you can see here. The major thrust faults are east-west trending and have overprinting of multiple phases of metamorphism. And these are also the oldest known structures. The strike slip faults are generally northeast, southwest trending, and which are at places displaced by normal faults. The northwest, southwest trending strike slip faults are of 2 generations, and the oldest one you can see is the Mount Petra fault zone, and the width of this zone is around 1 kilometer or so. The second deformational structures are situated in the western part of oasis, and approximately 10 parallel faults have been reported earlier. Also, the Schumacher oasis represents an exhumed topography with structural hills, glacial valleys, and Roche Mountain. 6 nearly parallel glacial valleys confirming to the regional structures traversed through the oasis. 2 relatively younger valleys, which are here, are north, northeast, south, southwest in directions. All the lakes are situated in the older glacial valleys, which are separated by high grounds with the adjacent valley. The younger valleys, of course, have steep and clean cut walls. So these are some of the field photographs. If you can see, these are the glacial striations, which are over the Roche Mountain. Then we have these type, the valley floor is occupied by pattern ground, as shown in figure 4. Then we have parallel laminated silt mud facies, which are sandwiched between the gravel units or the boulder units, and this is how these units are seen there. So coming on, these are further some of the photographs of the surfaces which are exposed in the Long Lake area of the Schumacher oasis. And the Long Lake area is in the central part of the oasis. You can see here the panoramic view. And here at least 4 levels of surfaces which can be mapped. And additionally, the Dakshin Gangotri Glacier, or the ice tongue of the continental ice sheet, is here, and it originates from here, this Long Lake. And in this valley, the valley floor, as I have shown, is occupied by the pattern ground and all, and then the Roche Mountain, etc., have the glacial striations. These are basically glacial moraines, which are further modified by the later events of these lakes and subaerial processes. This is another section which you can say near Lake E2, where again we can easily identify 3 major surfaces with the moraines comprising them. And the major facies which we can identify are the diamecton facies, which are massive. Then we have diamectons which are stratified, and then sand with horizontal lamination and things like that. So these are the close-ups of the facies, if you can see. So the first one is the diamecton, which have a matrix-supported massive, structureless, and mixture ranging in size from clay to boulders. The next one is the fine-grained facies having drop stones-like things. Then the SH facies, which is the sand horizontal facies, it shows penny-contemporaneous deformation, or we may say that soft sediment deformation structures. You can see normal faults in between the sand and silt interlaminations, and DMM facies, which is mostly structureless, have shear foliation planes and brachiated clasts. Again, these are the some of the other facies in this location. And if you see the lithofacies association, then the massive diamectons are with the fine sands, and then we have DMS and FI along with FD. So basically, these are glacial till deposits, which are as deposited as lodgement till, and also have outwash deposits. Now coming on to, we have also done some clast analysis, clast fabric studies, And we could see that in this area, this is the whole oasis, and you can see the point A, B, and C. These are the details of it. The clasts are oriented in the sections. If we take samples from the exposed section, these clasts are oriented in a certain manner. But if we take from the top of the surface, which shows that these are reworked and these are haphazardly covered everywhere. So coming on to the glacial striations and the features associated with them, we have identified them in field and glacial. As we know, glacial striations are the scratches and grooves which are formed on the bedrock as a result of abrasion of glaciers. The fine linear cut marks made by abrasion are termed as striations, which you can see here, and the deeper ones are the grooves. Here you can see the orientation of grooves and striations are different as marked by the Brenton and the hammer. We did detailed travels in the field and covered almost all of the area of the oasis, which are free of ice and unconsolidated glacial till. The valley floor is occupied by unglaciated glacial deposits and the landlocked Paleolake deposits. The adjacent valley wall and surfaces of Rocky Mountain were investigated. The orientation data of 276 glacial striations were collected from 20 different sites. With the help of a Brenton compass, we noted the orientation of them. And further, these orientations were corrected as per the magnetic field declination of the IGRF model profile parameters for the year 2017, when this fieldwork has been done. The glacial striation data are plotted as a moving average rose diagram using an Excel program provided by Mauro and Blenkinshoff in 2012. The reason for taking a moving average approach rather than the conventional rose diagram plot is to visualize the generalized trend of the glacial striation and if any major directional variation prevails spatially throughout the studied region. So you can see the orientation data collected in this can be differentiated in three major parts: the northern margin, which is basically these data sets, like GS10, GS22, GS20, GS20, GS3, and GS7. These present at the proximate of the present day margin is. And then we have the southern margin, comprising of 7 sets of striations, namely GSS10, GSS11, GS21, GS18, GS19, GS11, and the intermediate zone in between in the middle part of the oasis. There we have GS9, GS8, GS13, GS24, etc. The vector mean of northern and southern margin are 38 degree and 60 degree respectively, if you see here. And interestingly, the major sites along the northern margin of the Srimachal oasis are north-south oriented, and these are mostly unidirectional. On the contrary, if we see data from the southern margin and the intermediate zone, these two sets, these are bidirectional, and the dominant direction of the movement of the ice sheet is north-northeast, south-southeast, with few exhibiting proximities towards northeast to southeast, and further fewer to east-west direction. It can be inferred that these striations show different advances of the same ice sheet, but the orientation is maintained with minor marginal cross movements. Again, if you see this data set, which is basically GPS network data, earlier work by Sunil et al. In 2007, which ascertained the present rate of movement and direction of continental ice sheet using the global positioning system, which is GPS. The GPS network studied in campaign mode had 21 ground stations and have an interstation difference of around 5 kilometers, which were homogeneously distributed in a mesh network. The movement direction towards the north-northeast direction was reported in this work by Sunil et al., and which is also consistent with our data sets of the glacial striations. Additionally, this part, the work done by Murthy et al., is the subsurface deep electrical conductivity structure beneath the Srimachar oasis was studied using the magnetocaloric method. MT uses the natural electromagnetic field for imaging the electrical resistivity structures of the Earth. So as the MT method has a wide range of applications and is used to infer subsurface features from shallow to deep level, hence a direct connection can be established between deep crystal features and the surface glacial movements. However, shallow crystal features such as faults and ecological boundaries, also studied using MT data, can be cross-checked with the geological mapping on the surface. These studies, which was done by Murthy, was covered throughout the length of the oasis, and approximately 16 kilometers. The length of the survey was around 16 kilometers, and it reveals a highly resistive upper crust having a geoelectric strike of 15 degrees. Furthermore, they have reported that the thinning of the upper crust has been reported from 20 kilometers to 10 kilometers in the west. In the 20 kilometers was in the east, and the western part is 10 kilometers things. So interestingly, the present study, which deals with surficial glacial striations, which we have done, as manifested, we have shown them these are as the manifestation of glacial movements, which are from the past, have a generalized trend of 15 degree east. And it correlates with the MT data. If you can see, this is the composite, which we form in B, and this correlates with the overall, which is marked by Murthy here. So this is there. So this indicates that the modification and movement of glacier, even in the case of continental ice sheet, is strongly influenced by the pre-existing surface and the subsurface geological structures. As recently, it has been demonstrated by Burton and Johnson that the geothermal heat flow releases to the Earth's surface by convection or conduction in the crust, and then it accelerates the basal melting of glaciers and ice sheets. As estimated earlier, the thickness of the crust varies from 10 to 20 kilometers in west to east direction of the Srimachar oasis. The geological discontinuities in the form of brittle deformation structures, such as strike-slip faults in the eastern part of the oasis, probably makes it ideal to experience more geothermal heat or the geothermal heat flow. The difference in the crustal thickness facilitates the differential geothermal heat flow across the east-west direction of the Srimachar oasis, which further facilitates enhanced melting in the eastern part as compared to the oasis. As a result, the annual recession of the polar ice sheet in the eastern part is more, as reported by the work of Geological Survey of India. They are monitoring the ice sheet recession for the past 3 decades, and but such recession has not been observed in the western part of the oasis. So the flow of the glacier is controlled by the ice surface, slope, and topography, as we all know. But on the other hand, the structural discontinuities in the bedrock dictate the formation of weaker planes and zones of disintegration. The result direction of paleo flow of glaciers in Srimachar oasis is 15 degree. Although the bulk of the striations are north-northeast direction, which is in concurrence with the present movement of continental ice sheet as demonstrated by the GPS data of Sunil et al. 2007 and the subsurface data of Murthy et al. 2013. So in a nutshell, we can say that the primary orientation of the valleys in Srinagar Oasis is guided by the structure of the country rock and the major deformations. Sorry, and just a minute. And the major deformations, whereas yeah, just a minute. I'm sorry for this last minute glitch. Yes, whereas the primary orientation of the valley in Srinagar Oasis is guided by the country rock and the major deformation entities like fault and shear zones. In Srinagar Oasis, after analyzing the surface glacial striations, bedrock geology, present movement of the continental ice sheet, and the subsurface empty data, we may postulate that the guiding force for movement of glaciers and landform evolution lies in bedrock and subsurface geology. These results are already being published in the journal Polar Science, and I'm thankful for the organizers to give me a chance, and also acknowledge the efforts of the 35th, 37th, and 40 Indian scientific expeditions to Antarctica. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Remember, if you have questions, please go to the question and answer box. Let's move on to our second talk. The presenter is Michael Stone from the Louisiana State University in the US, and he's going to talk about dating alpine glacier moraines in Taylor Valley. Michael, you're on. Mute.
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
the mute button was acting up. Hi, I'm Michael Stone. I'm a PhD candidate from Louisiana State University, and today I'm going to be talking about dating alpine glacier moraines in Lower Taylor Valley and what this research implies for the regional climate and proglacial lakes during the Ross I glaciation. So the Ross I glaciation occurred in the late Pleistocene, early Holocene, and it is the most recent of several glacial events to occur in the Ross Sea region. It's marked by the northward advance of the Ross ice sheet grounding line to eventually reach somewhere around the continental shelf edge of Antarctica. When this happened, it caused changes in weather patterns and caused precipitation to shift northward, leading to drier climates in areas such as the McMurdo Dry Valleys, which is the largest relatively ice-free part of Antarctica. This research takes place in Taylor Dry Valley, and Taylor Valley trends east-west and opens at the eastern end to the McMurdo Sound, which is part of the Ross Sea. And during the Ross I glaciation, the Ross ice sheet grounded in the mouth of Taylor Valley, sealing off the valley. Because of a reduction in precipitation, it's hypothesized that local alpine glaciers retreated due to less accumulation in their accumulation zones. And this left the valley floor pretty wide open. A series of perch deltas strewn throughout Taylor Valley, such as this one in this photograph here, indicate that lake levels in Taylor Valley were once much higher. These align with the Ross I glaciation. The highest elevation for a perch delta within Taylor Valley is 240 meters above sea level, indicating that that was a high stand level for this proglacial lake known as Glacial Lake Washburn. For those of you who have read the literature on this, you'll also note that some lake levels are suggested to be much higher. That's based on the presence of these linear features that are thought by some to be strand lines. However, by others, they're being mapped as moraines, which is why I'm differentiating the two. However, if you follow these, if you map these as strand lines and follow them into an adjacent valley, you'll find deltas reaching 350 meters above sea level. So that would mark a alternative high stand level for glacial Lake Washburn. So it's supposed to be drier, so where's all this water come from? Well, it's hypothesized that this is coming off of the Ross ice sheet. Because there's a reduction in snow, the snow cover on the ice sheet is reduced, so you get an exposure of that like pretty blue glacier ice, which lowers the ice sheet's albedo and facilitates more melt. And the greater meltwater production is then channeled into the different dry valleys, including Taylor Valley. During times when the Ross ice sheet was receiving more snow, the lake level would then drop because albedo would increase and melt would then decrease. And vice versa is true. If there's less snow, lake levels rise. This means that glacial Lake Washburn is an excellent indicator of paleoclimate during this time. But to do that, we have to establish a chronology. There are chronologies established for glacial Lake Washburn. However, they rely heavily on organic radiocarbon. And in an area where the radiocarbon reservoir effect is yet to be constrained, this, a need for alternate methods is apparent. So luminescence dating, IRSL and OSL, has been used successfully to date deltas throughout Taylor Valley and in other valleys. However, to get a luminescence sample, you have to dig down from the surface about a half meter at least. And that means that when you're using luminescence samples, you can only get stuff in the far past. You can't get that last, everything that happened since that sample was deposited isn't recorded in a luminescence sample. So if we want to understand the downfall of glacial Lake Washburn, its last stages, we have to find a way to date the surface. So in comes inorganic radiocarbon in the form of in situ carbon-14 cosmogenic radionuclide dating, where we would just pick up a rock from the surface, say, okay, this was set down by an ice sheet and then immediately covered by a lake allegedly. And that means its first exposure is going to start when the lake level drops below the cosmic nuclide. So we said, can we do this? And we got funding to go out and see, but we have to prove that this method works. And in order to prove this method works, we decided that, okay, well, if you have, where after the red sample, a surface sample that indicates this lake level drop, it has to date sometime after an IRSL, a luminescence sample from Perch Delta, which was deposited when lakes were covering this Cosmos sample, and sometime before the date from a Cosmos sample from a stream cut. To clarify a little bit, here we have a block diagram showing a stream running into an ice-covered lake, and we have a delta at the end of the stream. This delta is forming actively. That means our luminescence sample in blue is being actively deposited. Its clock starts. Lake levels drop, then the Cosmos sample's clock starts if it's at around the same elevation. And then the stream cuts through the delta and that clock starts. So like I said, we got funding to go out and do this and test this method out. We collected Cosmos samples and IRSL samples from all throughout Lower Taylor Valley. But we also focused on getting samples along alpine moraines, where those alpine moraine samples lined up by elevation with deltas, just to see, okay, well, if we don't get the results we want, like these are either going to tell us, these ones along the moraine, they're either going to tell us about lake level drop, or they're going to tell us about the moraine. At least we get something that we can use. And so to answer the question above, while we don't have all the data in yet, so far the answer is no. But we've still been able to, because we collected samples strategically, we've still been able to use these data to learn about the landscape. The big thing we're learning, the big thing I'll focus on today is looking at the glaciers. So what we learned is certain alpine glaciers were actually more advanced during some parts of the Ross I glaciation than they are today. We have 2 of 4 dates back from Canada Glacier. Those are dating to an average of 13.5 thousand years ago, and that's on this end moraine of Canada Glacier. The reason we know this is not lake level, and this is a date from the moraine, is the fact that the upper site was exposed after the lower site was exposed. This is the opposite would be true if we were actually dating anything with lake level. It also doesn't align with our hypothesized pattern of deltas and the timing of stream cuts and everything like that. Crescent Glacier moraine, we have a single sample back from the moraine itself, and that dates to around 24,000 years ago. So this implies that the alpine glaciers were more advanced during at least some parts of the Ross I glaciation than they are today. Here's an exciting animation. I'll play that again. Woohoo. But if they're more advanced, that means we're having more accumulation in their accumulation zones. So the question is, where is that coming from? It's supposed to be drier. Well, part of that could be from snow and ice blowing off the Ross ice sheet and depositing in the valleys. The other possibility is that bluing hypothesis of the Ross ice sheet. With decreased accumulation of snow, you get bluer, you get more meltwater pools. You have these dry valleys that respond to heat changes more readily. So you get hot air that rises, it pulls stuff off the ice sheet, and you get precipitation in the dry valleys, an increase in precipitation, and you get an advance of your alpine glaciers. As far as Glacial Lake Washburn goes, if you go with the 350 meter above sea level Glacial Lake Washburn, there's a chance it sneaks around this advanced Canada glacier somewhere around Andrews Ridge and can pour into the rest of the valley. However, if we focus just on the 240 meter above sea level lake level indicated by the highest delta in Taylor Valley, which happens to be in the Frixel Basin, then we're stuck with a lake that at least at some point and possibly throughout its lifetime was contained just in the Frixel Basin. And for those of you keeping score, if this lake was only constrained to the Frixel Basin, it would fall more in line with Pewey's originally hypothesized Glacial Lake Rivard rather than Glacial Lake Washburn. So in conclusion, some alpine glaciers in the dry valleys advanced during the Ross I glaciation. The advance of these alpine glaciers indicates a local increase in snow and ice accumulation rather than the decrease we hypothesized. And an advance of Canada Glacier may have inhibited the formation of a valley-long lake. And then some acknowledgements. This research was sponsored by an EAGER grant for trying to find that new geochronometer, also from the McMurdo Dry Valleys, LETER and LSU. And thanks to Will and Maddie for carrying lots of rocks for me.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. I appreciate that. That's an interesting talk. Thanks for staying on time as well. Remember, those of you who have questions, we need you to write them in the question and answer box, and we'll get to them here after the first 5 presentations. The next presentation is one of the 2 that we have today that were pre-recorded, and it's by Sherou Yin from the Second Institute of Oceanography in China. And if our colleagues in India could upload the presentation, that would be great.
Hello everyone, I'm Xiaoyu Yin from Second Institute of Oceanography, Ministry of Natural Resources, China. Yeah, I'm very happy being here with you in the session with a bedform development in mixed turbidite contrite systems. An example from the Cosmonaut C East Antarctic. This work is the outcome of the international collaboration. My topic includes 3 parts: introduction, bedforms and their formation, and the last one, a brief summary. As we know, in the deep sea setting, there is 3 types of deposits: turbidite, contrite, and pelagite. Turbidite is related to turbidite current, and contrite is formed by bottom current, and pelagite is the pelagic setting. Here is a brief model for the sedimentary processes. Here, for example, the downslope is dominated by the turbidite current, And in the water column, also there's a large-scale water mass circulation and overflow. Also, there is some small-scale oceanographic processes. For example, eddies and internal waves. They have could have also influenced the seafloor deposition. Actually, more often we found that the co-occurrence of the turbidite and the chondrite, here called the mixed systems. There is main three types of mixed systems. The one is chondrite turbidite alternations, and the second is the distribution of the turbidite current deposits by bottom current, and the third one is interaction by synchronous bottom and turbidite flows. The first two types is related to only one type of current processes. For example, only the bottom current or the turbidite current. But the third one is related to the composed flow of the bottom current and the turbidite current. So we mainly focus on this type. Here is an example of the mixed systems is from west of Antarctic Peninsula. We can see here there's a channel and the drift on the overbank. So here is a mixed system. Another one is Argentine margin. Here is also the channel and the drift. We can also see the migration of the channel. Is related to the development of the drift. This is a general model for the mixed systems. Generally, the bottom currents could pirate the fine sediment and from the upstream to the downstream. Here there is a flow tank experiment about the mixed system. The upper panel is without contour current, and the lower panel is with contour current from right to left, and with a velocity of about 14 centimeters per second. Here we can see. Yes, the current flow downslope and the bottom current flow from right to the left. We can clearly see that the fine sediment moved by the bottom current downstream and deposit in this side, in this area. The previous research is mainly focused on the large-scale geometry and the structure of the mixed systems, but it is a very lack of small-scale features research and the associated sedimentary processes. So here we focus on the Antarctic margin, the continental rise of the Cosmonaut Sea. Here there is a very developed submarine canyon channel systems and the downslope, and along slope there is Antarctic bottom water circulation, and so this is a very good site for the mixed system research. And here the multi-beam barometric map clearly shows the large-scale features. For example, the channel and the overbank deposits. The seismic lines across the channel system also clearly see the architecture of this system. The system is on sea about 24 million years, and here is other two seismic profiles along the system, along the channel, and clearly see the overbank deposits and some migration of sentinel waves. So if we see more clearly, we can see that some bed forms, these small scale features, bed forms. And for example, the sediment waves, also some sediment waves in the channel, and more sediment waves on the overbank, and also some furrows in the distal area. Here is a close-up of these features, for example, the sediment waves and the furrows. Here is the two barometric profiles across sediment waves and across the furrows. The sediment waves, the size of sediment waves decrease in downslope, but the furrows, it looks like it appears just in the distal area, and the size it look like is show no significant downslope changes. We are lucky that there is a sub-bottom profile across the channel system could provide us a higher resolution structure of the bed forms, for example, the migrating sediment waves. Here is some morphological parameters of the sediment waves and furrows. Yes, for interpretation this bed form formation, we cannot only use the current for the interpretation, because the current cannot explain the orientation of this overbank sediment waves and also the furrows. So we use a method that is similar to the force analysis, that is parallelogram rule, with two components. One component is turbulent current, and the other component is the Antarctic bottom water. So the composed component is the composed flow is marked by the purple. This method can explain the bed forms distribution very well. For example, the sediment waves on the overbank is developed by the composed flow, but within the channel, these bed forms are dominated by the turbulent current, but out of the channel on the overbank, they are dominated by the composed flow. It is interesting that the furrows are interpreted by the formation of the Antarctica bottom water. The evidence is mainly based on the furrows cut the sediment waves. That means furrows are formed after the sediment waves, and the orientation is nearly parallel the Antarctica bottom water. So we proposed a model with two steps. The first step is the energetic current flows through the channel and form within channel formed the scours and sediment waves, and in the overbank area, the overspilled current interact with Antarctica bottom water and formed the sediment waves. But after the injected current is weakened or disappeared, the only Antarctica bottom water swept the sea floor and eroded seafloor and formed the furrows. And why these furrows only appear on in the distal area of the overbank? Maybe because this area, the sediment on the seafloor is more finer, and if in the closer or nearby the channel, the sediment may be more coarser. So in the finer area, seafloor or seabed is more erodible. So here the furrows is distributed here. There's a summary. Yes, and the mixed system is the cosmonaut sea continental rise with prominent bed forms, and the confined to the current in the channel form the scours or sediment waves. But on the overbank area, the Antarctic bottom water interact with the overspill to the current and form the new mixed features dominated by the sediment waves and furrows or levees. Okay, at last, this research was founded by the project Impact and Response of Antarctic Seas to Climate Change.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. Remember, if you have questions, please place them in the question and answer box. And we'll go on to the fourth presentation in this grouping, and it's by Dan Morgan from Vanderbilt University in the USA. And he's going to talk about the glacial history and soil development in Ung Valley in Antarctica.
All right. Hello, everyone. And it's good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are around the world. And I just want to start by thanking all the co-authors that are on here. You'll see a lot of names here, and many of these are undergraduate students and even a high school student that have worked in my lab with me over the years. So I'm going to present a lot of data that they have pulled together over the years as we've been studying sort of the glacial and geomorphic history of Ong Valley in Antarctica. And obviously the project was funded by National Science Foundation, United States Antarctic Program grants, and other funding sources that you can see there. So in terms of motivation, Ong Valley is a really interesting valley in the middle of the central transantarctic mountains, and no one had ever really mapped or understood the glacial history of it. So our first field season there was really just trying to understand what's the record of glacial history here in Ong Valley? What's the age of these deposits, the origin, the previous extent? And then also, because these are really interesting dry valleys, like many of us study, what kind of geomorphic processes are active here? What is going on in these cold, dry landscapes that in some cases are many millions of years old? What kind of evolution is happening to the landscape there? So that's kind of our motivating questions here. So now, just a quick outline. I'm going to go through a lot of different data quickly here, but Ong Valley is in the middle of the Transantarctic Mountains, and it's kind of at the head of the Miller Range. It's the Argosy Glacier that drains right next to it, and that eventually meets up with the Marsh Glacier and drains through the Nimrod into the Ross Ice Shelf down there. So I'm going to talk a lot about cosmogenic exposure ages, degradation rates, erosion rates we've got. I'm going to look at provenance of these glacial tills, geochemistry of them, grain size data, carbon data, soil salts. We've done lots of different projects here in Ong Valley over the years. So again, just to orient ourselves a little bit, Ong Valley here on the left, you can see the topographic map is this kind of little, well, it's an upside down L or a backwards 7 shaped dry valley in here. Here's the Argosy Glacier flowing by and meeting the marsh. And as the Argosy Glacier and the East Antarctic ice sheet rises, this little thumb of it would extend farther into Ong Valley there. Here you can see a satellite image. We've mapped 3 really distinct till units. We just simply call them the young. There's a middle, there's an old unit. And then we collected a lot of different samples of them. So this map on the right is flipped from what you see on the left. But you'll see that we've collected rocks from the drifts. We've collected bedrock samples, soil samples. Some of them are just for zircon and other things. They're all labeled on there. I'll jump right into the data and the cosmogenic nuclide agents. And these are really interesting, and I don't have time to go through all of them. In the next couple of slides, I'll also talk about Marie Bergelin's paper that just came out this summer. I think even July 15th is the full publication date. So I'll refer you to some of those papers for more details. But basically, we collected a lot of boulders, some from moraines in there, but there are actually only a handful of moraines that we could really well map and sample in there. There is a beautiful end moraine that you can see in some of these images down here that we tried to sample and collect. We got a lot of scatter in our ages. So if you look at these graphs on the left, and these are, probability distribution functions of the ages, sometimes they line up really well. Sometimes there's a ton of scatter in them. The landscapes are active. There's a lot of cryoturbation polygon activity that's flipping these boulders over, we think. But we can establish some minimum ages from them. We also sometimes dug pits. Here we are digging a pit in the bottom image there. These data in the middle here are the depth or the concentrations of neon 21 we would get at depth in there. And that lets us establish kind of erosion rates, but also put minimum exposure ages on that end moraine at about 7 million years old. So this image on the right tries to kind of summarize. It gets a little messy in there, sorry, but these are kind of minimum exposure ages for all the boulders and moraines and things that we sampled out there. And you'll see a big scatter of ages, but the youngest drift is quite young. The middle ones, yeah, it's in the middle. The oldest drift is quite old. So if we had to summarize all those up, really, we'd get this youngest drift is a minimum age of about 13,000 years. The surface in the middle drift is at least 2 million years old, and that oldest drift, that end moraine, we think is about 7 million years old out there, which is quite old. I'll talk a little bit more, because what's really also fascinating is that underneath the youngest and middle drift, there's a bunch of buried ice. So I'll come back to that in a minute. We also sampled a bunch of bedrock. And then we can get erosion rates out of there. There's the granite harbor intrusives. It's locally called the Hope granite. There's also this Argosy gneiss. The erosion rates are low. The average is around 20 centimeters per million years. There's sort of one outlier that creeps up to around 70, but you'll see on the graphs on the right that most of these are clustered between 10, 20, 30 centimeters per million years of erosion rate that they're indicating. We also would measure things like the chemical index of alteration on them, and they're all quite low, looking like fresh granite. So we're seeing weathering by oxidation. You can see in these images that the rocks are getting red, but they're not really there's not really feldspar hydrolysis going on. There's not much liquid water here in that environment. So this buried ice, I'll come back to now. We went back in 2017 and cored into it. We got 2 shallow cores. They're about 10 meters long. And the ice is actually buried under about 60 or 70 centimeters of till under there. So then Marie's project was really getting the dirt out of the till. And here's her composite image of the ice core that we got. And you'll see there's some sections where it's clear and clean, and some sections where it's really dirty, where it looks more even like just ice cemented soil. And so based on the stratigraphy and then the concentration of beryllium and aluminum and neon at depth in here, she decided that there were really 2 buried ice masses in here. The upper one's about 3 million years old, and the lower one is about 4 to 5 million years old. That ice has been sublimating at a rate of about 23 meters per million years for about the last 3 million years, while its till on top of it is also eroding at about 20 centimeters per million years. So it's a really exciting paper. It just came out. I'll encourage you to look that up if you want to read more about this buried ice, because this is a really interesting archive of paleoclimate information that's right there on the surface. So we also looked at the source of these tills, and by that we looked at detrital zircons. We pulled zircon minerals out of them, did uranium lead age dating on them, and you can see the probability histograms here. I'll quickly summarize these by saying, well, the drifts all look statistically the same, and they all overlap. The ice does show a little bit of variation. It looks a little different than some of the tills, but we think some of that is really just from a sampling bias. You know, to make 60 centimeters a till, you've got to sublimate tens and tens of meters of ice, whereas we were only selecting, 20, 30 centimeter thick sections of ice to sample. So we think we just didn't quite capture the full provenance, the full suite of rocks that are in those when we collected the ice. But if we lump all the ice together, it looks like the tills as well. So we learned something about sampling, and we also learned that it looks like the ice flow of the Argosy Glacier was consistent each time it deposited these tills over perhaps 7 million years. We also did a lot of geochemistry on the bedrock and the soils. You can see that the soils over here, or the tills rather, are all plotting separately from the bedrock. We can look at chemical index of alteration, and it's interesting that the tills show lower values of that chemical index of alteration than the bedrock, right? There's rubidium strontium ratios we can look at. And again, it's interesting, the tills seem to be less weathered than the bedrock that's out there, which is kind of interesting. I'm going to cruise a little bit here in the interest of time, but through a bunch of our soil samples, we collected sort of upper samples we called tops. These were often 3 to 10 centimeters deep. And then we would collect bottom samples, and were more like 20, 30 centimeters deep in all the tills, as well as from some of the hills that were beyond the glacial limit. One of my students is a high school student who looked at grain size and organic carbon measurements on them this summer. So looking at the grain size, yeah, you can see that it's interesting. The grain size gets a little more, you would lose some of the fines over time, but you also lose a lot of the coarse stuff over time. So the young stuff has both a lot of coarse material, but also a lot of clay and silt size material in it. And then it kind of turns into more fine sand over time, which is interesting. The bigger pieces are weathering, but you're also blowing away the fine material. And then the hillside materials are much coarser and have very little fine material. In some cases, we couldn't even get a gram of clay-sized material out of these hillside samples to do further analyses on them. The organic carbon stuff is really interesting because I wasn't expecting much organic carbon in these drifts, but we actually were able, at least by measuring loss on ignition, we were able to measure a few percent of mass loss when we burn these samples. There are some carbonates in here, so there may be some carbon that's or carbonate material that's lost in this, but the fact that the provenance is all the same, we'd expect that to be the same in all 3 tills. And the fact that it increases with age is kind of intriguing and doesn't seem to really trend with grain size. And that's also really intriguing. All right, I'm going to wrap up in a minute here. We also measured aerosol salts in these. I just picked a couple of the ones that we collected. I could made 18 different plots on here. But if you look at concentrations of nitrate or chloride that we measured in the tills and in the hills, you'll see on the left just a general increase in time. If we just simply take the averages of what we measured over there, we see fairly nice trends increasing with time, which again is really intriguing to extend these kind of methods back 7 million years. I will say for the hills, I just made up an age of 8 million years to just plot them on there. We don't really have an exposure age for them, but they should be older than the glacial material. So that's just to show about where they would plot on there. So to quickly summarize, what's amazing about Ong Valley is there's a really old history of glacial activity here going back about 7 million years, and it's still right here on the surface, and in some cases with beautiful end moraines still intact. The provenance data indicates consistent flow of the Argosy Glacier, depositing that material each time. Erosion rates are really low. The ice sublimation rates are kind of the dominant process in here. And there's certainly a lot of polygonal and cryoturbation going on. In all of these data, it's consistent that there's a lack of liquid water. And that's also apparent, I didn't talk about this, but in the pits we collected, there's not all evidence of vertical mixing in many of our pits, which is really interesting. And so I'll stop there and turn it on to our next talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dan, for a very interesting talk. Again, if anyone has questions, please put them in the question and answer box. We'll try to get to them after the next presentation. The next presentation is also a virtual one. It's by Liza McDonough from the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organization in Australia. And the title of the talk is Processes Driving Ice-Free Antarctic Surface Water Chemistry and Projected Future Changes. If our colleagues in India could turn on that presentation, we'd greatly appreciate it. Thanks.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me here at SCAR. My name's Lisa McDonough and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation. And today I'm going to be giving a bit of an overview of what we know about Antarctic lake water chemistry, the processes that drive the water chemistry in these environments, and also how these environments could be affected by climate change in the future. This work forms part of the Australian Research Council's Special Research Initiative SAFE, which in part aims to deliver interdisciplinary science to forecast environmental change across Antarctica, the subantarctic and the Southern Ocean. So why are we even interested in Antarctic lakes? Well, most lake studies, including global lake studies, exclude Antarctic lakes. So the natural processes that occur in these environments are not well understood, and their chemical compositions are also not well understood compared to other regions. Antarctic lake studies are important as polar lakes are early indicators of climate change. And so in particular, ice-free Antarctic lakes integrate a range of upstream catchment processes and are therefore very sensitive to changes in the climate and the landscape. So for example, changes in temperature can dramatically alter water availability, and that can cause shifts in bedrock weathering, soil formation, vegetation growth and expansion, nutrient availability and microbial compositions, and all of those things can affect the water chemistry of Antarctic lakes. So Antarctic lakes can be fresh, saline or brackish. They may be fully mixed, partially mixed or not mixed at all. So this figure here is showing an example of a fully mixed lake and a partially mixed lake. With partially mixed lakes or unmixed lakes, you normally have stratification and a layer of anoxic, saline and nutrient-rich water at the bottom of the lake. Lakes can be supraglacial or subglacial. Subglacial lakes are formed by pressure-induced basal melting or geothermal heat in Antarctica. And surface lakes are formed by precipitation or meltwater inputs. And these surface lakes can be ice-free or they may be ice-covered. So surface lakes in Antarctica are normally found along the coastline, and you can see these green dots in the map are showing the location of current Antarctic lakes, surface lakes. Most of these lakes are small, so around 67% of them are less than 0.1 kilometre squared, and they have a similar size distribution to Arctic lakes. The presence and the numbers of surface lakes can vary with season or year, and that's based on climate. So you might have a lake that's normally ice covered in winter. However, if you have a warmer year, you might have a completely ice-free lake for the entire period of the year. So our aims for this study were to summarize the processes that drive the water chemistry of Antarctic lakes. We also wanted to compile published data sets to understand the baseline distributions of various water chemistry parameters in ice-free lakes across Antarctica. And we want to use IPCC shapefiles to determine the likely impacts of climate change on precipitation and temperature at Antarctic surface lake locations. And determining the major factors that affect lake water chemistry will help us to pinpoint key indicators of climate change in these systems. By quantifying baseline lake chemical compositions, this will help us to determine the rate and extent of any future changes. So we identified a number of different key processes that affect lake water chemistry and also the traces that we use to identify them. These include sea spray aerosols, water rock interactions, meltwater inputs and evaporation, biogenic processes, and dust or aerosols. Our preliminary results show that Antarctic freshwater lakes have lower silica and calcium than global rivers and groundwaters, but they do have higher sodium, potassium, chloride, and sulfate than global rivers and groundwaters. The Antarctic ice-free saline lakes have lower mean concentrations of major ions, including sulfate, potassium, and calcium, which are all less than 40% of those found in global saline basins. And in particular, the silica is low and even lower than global rivers or groundwater. So these maps here are showing the IPCC shapefile images of changes in temperature and precipitation in Antarctica that are expected under 1.5, 2, and 4 degrees Celsius temperature change or global warming scenario. So the bar plots that are next to the maps are showing the change in temperature and precipitation at each of those lake locations for each of those global warming scenarios. And so what this tells us is that precipitation increases of around 5 to 52% are expected at current lake locations, depending on the degree of global warming, so 1.5, 2, or 4 degrees. And we're expecting temperature increases of between 1.2 to 5.6 degrees Celsius at current lake locations. And what we can see is that there's a greater range of precipitation and temperature increases with greater global warming. And this will likely lead to changes in lake numbers and sizes. Temperature increases further south could alter the distribution of lakes, so we may see meltwater lakes occurring at higher elevations. Temperature increases could result in meltwater lakes appearing earlier in the summer. And we may also see decreased duration of ice cover or a complete shift from ice-covered to ice-free lakes in the future. Increases in stream flows and stream width due to greater quantities of meltwater. That would increase the weathering, the area that weathering can occur. And so we might see more soil and bedrock weathering inputs, particularly in lower elevation lakes in the future. Increased temperatures may deepen the active layers, releasing stored organic matter and other ions that become available for leaching into streams and lakes. And increased numbers of lakes at higher elevations are likely to contain less bedrock weathering elements and more snowmelt derived ions. And finally, greater nutrient inputs due to increased vegetation colonization and possible shifts in microbial compositions may occur at permanent lake locations. There are a couple of other things that we need to consider. So understanding Antarctic lakes better will help us with research in other fields, including studies of ice sheets and microbial community compositions. So, for example, increased lake volumes may lead to an increased chance of lake drainage and ice sheet collapse, which was the case in 2002 when the Larsen B ice shelf collapsed after a series of meltwater ponds formed. And you can see these meltwater ponds here and the animations just showing that collapse. And in addition to that, bacteria and microbes in Antarctic lakes are extremely unique and also highly vulnerable. So if we see temperature increases, for example, the presence and the availability of these novel species may be compromised, and that has implications for medical and other fields. We identified a couple of key research gaps in the literature, and these included multi-season and multi-year studies, so looking at the water chemistry at various points throughout a season and throughout a year, and that would help us to constrain the seasonal and annual variability in these systems and improve our understanding of the baseline composition of Antarctic lakes. There's also seems to be a lack of studies into the nutrient concentration sources and cycling of carbon and nitrogen, for example, in Antarctic lakes, and these require further investigation so that we can understand potential increases in greenhouse gas releases from lakes under climate warming. So we are in the middle of our data compilation, and we are searching for additional published or unpublished data from Antarctic ice-free lakes. So please do get in touch if you know of any data or if you know anyone that might be able to assist. And my email's up there on the screen for anyone who would like to contact me. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Liza, even though you're not with us. That was a really nice presentation. Thank you very much. So we're going to look at the questions and answer box here. And please feel free to submit them as I go, as Melissa and I go through them. The first one here is for Dan. And it says, Dan, thanks for your talk. Might the increases and loss on emission in the Ong Valley sediments partly be dehydration of gypsum? Have you looked at the mineralogy of the sediments to see if gypsum is there?
Thanks. That's a great question. The answer is no, and I like the suggestion, so I'll have to look into that. I think what's intriguing to me about the data, though, is the increase in the loss of ignition over time that we see, whereas the other data seem to suggest the provenance, the material should be the same in all of them. So they should, if there was gypsum, I would expect it to all be the same again, or if it was carbonates, I'd expect them to be the same. But that's something definitely to look into. So thank you.
Okay, it appears that is the only question that we have. Does anyone else have a question they would like to ask? Please send it to us. Dan,
Sure,
are you raising your hand?
Yeah, I can raise a hand here. I'd like to ask Mike a question if you're here still, Mike. I get intrigued when I see glaciers meeting lakes and start thinking about like outburst floods or anything like that. And I couldn't quite remember if it was the 240 or the 350, but I mean, is there any evidence of something like that happening in Taylor Valley? Were there any outburst floods or anything like that?
So you might have seen along the eastern edge, we took some samples along Coral Ridge to try to look into that. There is a scour through Coral Ridge, which, sorry, that's the eastern end of the valley. It goes north-south across the valley and kind of cuts it off. That's the high point. There's a scour through there. I don't have the calculation in front of me, but at one point I calculated it and it was a little underwhelming, the volume that should create a scour of that size, or like the discharge rate. I don't, yeah, there's not like substantial evidence for outburst flooding, but I'm not going to say it's not there. So skirting around the question a little bit.
Okay, great. Thanks for the question, Dan, and thanks for the answer, Mike. Anybody else? Okay, that was the first part of the session, and I want to especially thank the speakers. It was really a diverse group of talks and very well presented. So thank you all very much. And I'm going to turn it over to my co-convener, Melisa Diaz, to introduce the next 5 talks.
Hi, thanks everyone. Hopefully you can hear me just fine. So our first speaker for the second portion of the session is actually Barry Lyons at The Ohio State University, and he'll be giving a talk on the products of chemical weathering and aluminosilicates in streams in the McMurdo dry valleys. And just a second while we share our screen here. Okay.
Thank you, Melissa. And I want to take the opportunity to thank my co-authors and our funding sources and our supporters over the years that have been involved in this work, which I've done on this slide here. So I'm not going to spend much on this slide because Mike did a great job in presenting not only the information on the McMurdo dry valleys, but particularly on Taylor Valley and the climate history. So I was part of the long-term ecological research site group that have been studying the McMurdo Dry Valleys, particularly Taylor Valley, since 1992. And what I'll just point out to you is this map of Taylor Valley. You can see the 3 closed basin lakes that Mike talked about in his talk. And our group's been working along with others in the LTR on the streams and the stream chemistries. And I'm going to particularly focus on the large number of streams that flow into Lake Frixell at the top right-hand corner of the photograph. So over these 24 years that I was involved with the LTR, it's still going on. We collected stream chemistry every year, a number of times in each of the streams that you just saw in that photograph. And this is a log plot of the dissolved silica concentration on the vertical and the chloride concentration on the horizontal. And you can see that the silica concentration varies by over 2 orders of magnitude, with high values approaching 300 micromolar. And because of the very, very low concentrations of dissolved silica and ice and snow, the vast majority of this silica is coming from the weathering of aluminosilicate minerals in the streams themselves. And the way these streams work, this is just a cartoon of kind of an incised channel versus a wider, flatter channel. And during low flows, we get flow in the channel. And I'm really interested in what I call saturated alluvium. I'm going to refer to that as the hyperrheic zone. And water flows not only in the channel, but into the banks and the subsurface sediments of the streams. And the inundation is much more severe during high flows. And this is where we think the bulk of the chemical weathering is occurring in the system, in these hyperrheic zones, these saturated sediments. And here's a picture that this is Wales Stream. You're looking out into McMurdo Sound. You can just barely see Mount Erebus in the background there, but you can see the stream flowing from, in this case, the Commonwealth Glacier down into New Harbor, but you can see the wetted area along the sides of the stream. This is the hyperrheic zone, and that hyperrheic zone retains water even when the flows are this low. It's draining water out of those interstices in the porosity of these sediments. And again, this rock-water interaction within the hyperrheic zone is where we think the bulk of the action in terms of chemical weathering is going on. So what we wanted to think about is, what effect does freeze-thaw play in the weathering process? We know that as the sun goes around the horizon during the austral summer, these streams vary and discharge tremendously. And again, as I mentioned, a part of this water that gets into the hyperrheic zone during high flows stays in the hyperrheic zone and freezes as the temperature decreases. And we know that, or we think we know that this freezing water in the hyperrheic zone enhances physical weathering, the breaking apart of minerals. But the question we wanted to ask is, what effect, if any, does this freeze-thaw have on the chemical composition, not of the water itself, but of the alteration products of weathering? And so the next slide is just a brief summary of what's known in Antarctica and in cold regions in general. And surprisingly, there hasn't been a lot of work done, but what the work has shown is that people have either done through experiments or by observational information have suggested that the formation of zeolites and or amorphous silica with a mix of maybe some aluminum in it are produced by the freezing of these waters in the hyperrheic zone. And this production of this amorphous solid is probably done through the polymerization of silicic acid or dissolved silica as freezing occurs. So what we wanted to do is to see if in these sediments or in these stream sediments, if we could reproduce some of the earlier work. So what we did was a very simple-minded experiment. We took two of the major bedrock of the Taylor Valley, a dolerite and a granite specimen. We crushed them up. We just placed them in a reaction vessel, added water, added deionized water. And then we had one set of experiments that we kept at 7 degrees centigrade throughout. That's our kind of our background or control. And then we had another set of experiments, one with the dolomite, one with the granite, which we froze for 12 hours and then thawed them for 36 hours for a number of days. And we analyzed the solutions for major cations and anions, but most importantly for this talk, dissolved silica. And these are the results of some of the experiments. And what you're looking at, that top graphic is the dolomite, and you're seeing the blue triangles are the control experiments where we just have water and the crushed rock. The red squares are the freeze-thaw experiments where 12 hours of freeze, 36 hours of thaw. The bottom is the same type of plot except for the granite. And you can see that in the freeze-thaw plots, the dissolved silica concentrations remained at a very low level, while in general, the silica concentrations increased in the controls. And you can notice that the dolomite actually produced more silica than the granite did, which we would have predicted. Our interpretation of this is that during the freeze cycle, as I showed you in the previous slide, we interpret that the dissolved silica that's forming via weathering is actually being removed by the freezing process. And the other thing we did is Sue Welsh, who works with our group, took some sediments from the Frixell Basin streams and looked at them under SEM. And so what you're looking at is some SEM images of olivine, apatite, pyroxene, biotite. And what you can see is these grains, these crystal grains are not very weathered at all. You can see euhedral faces on the olivines. You can see abrasion kind of rounding and breaking off in the apatite. And you can see really broken up crystals in the biotite and some etch pits, a little bit of etching on the pyroxene. So most of the sediments in these streams don't show evidence of great amounts of chemical weathering. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But in other cases, we do see the effect of weathering. And so you're looking at the image on the left. Notice the scales. That's 100 microns on the left, and it's only that 5 micron scale on the right-hand side. But on the left, that's an augite, a well-rounded augite. And right next to it, in the upper, to its upper right, is a grain that looks very unweathered, but the augite looks to be weathered and rounded. And if you take a smaller image of that, smaller scale image on the right-hand side, you can see that it's coated with nanocrystalline amorphous, mostly silica. There's a little bit of aluminum and some sodium and iron in that coating, but that's very amorphous. That bright color is the amorphous silica aluminum oxide that we're seeing on the crystal surfaces. So we speculate, not just on the work that we've done, but what I showed you earlier, that we think that as the water freezes in these hyperrheic zones, we get smaller and smaller volumes. We create almost brine. In some cases, gases exsolve including CO2, which increases the pH, which would lead to the precipitation of a zeolite. When zeolites have been found in Antarctic stream sediments, and that's the first equation that I showed you. Or we get an increased polymerization, as pointed out earlier, and we form this amorphous aluminum olefin type material that was suggested by Crompton et al. In 2015, which is that second equation. But we also assume that the rate of freezing probably plays a major role in how much of this material is formed and what type of chemistry of this solid we end up with. So in conclusion, we've run these simple laboratory experiments, the freeze-thaw, that stimulate daily behavior of the hyperrheic zones. And we observe in all cases the lower dissolved silica concentrations. And we also see lower concentrations of calcium, magnesium, sodium, and potassium as well, which is a reproduction of some of the experiments that Dietzel did in 2005. I've shown you the SEM images that demonstrate the lack of chemical weathering in many of the sediment grains, but enhanced chemical weathering in others. And this supports some of the early work on the LTR done by Mike Gusev and Diane McKnight and others, published in 2003, that looking at sediments in the Frixel Basin streams, most of the material they saw was unaltered primary igneous material, just like I just showed you. But they did observe weathering products in the finest grained part of the sediment, but it's only about 0.3% of the total sediment present. So we're getting these amorphous silica, aluminum constructs, but they're not found in high concentrations. So the implication is that the precipitation of amorphous silica-rich solids does occur, and it's probably due to this freeze-thaw. And the interesting thing is, as our experiments showed, the previous work showed that little of this material was redissolved, even though the stream is undersaturated with amorphous silica. So we precipitate them, it's hard to redissolve them. And we speculate that this allophane type alumina silicate, or even something that is feldspathic in nature, are being formed by the process. So I want to acknowledge our funding support from the National Science Foundation, folks that helped us in the field, the contractor and the helicopter support. And also the work couldn't have been done without my colleagues Diane McKnight and Mike Gusev and their students who've collected a lot of these samples. And we also acknowledge the use of the SEM facility here at Ohio State. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing any questions at the end. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for your talk, Barry. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll also accept questions from the first half of this session at the end of the session. So our next speaker is Hebin Xiao from the Polar Research Institute of China. Just want to make sure that you're on the call. Yep. And they'll be talking about the provenance of clay-sized sediments around ice shelves in Antarctica and their chemical weathering.
Okay,
so
thank you. Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to have the presentation. This is Hebin Xiao from Polar Research Institute of China, and here I want to show you something about the provenance of clay-sized marine sediments and the indication for continental weathering in Antarctic. Yeah, this is the outline. The first layer is the background in the margins.
Are you sharing? If you're sharing your screen, we can't see anything. You have to click the share screen.
Yeah, I'm sorry about it. Yeah. Okay. Can you see it?
It's just loading. 1 second. I'm not seeing anything. Dan, are you getting anything on your end?
Yeah, I shared my screen.
Yeah,
Just a moment,
still
please.
loading on my end.
Okay.
Now it's coming.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
Looks great. Thanks.
This is the outline of my presentation. And the first is the background in the margins of Antarctic. And the center is the source to sink of clay-sized sediments in the front end of major ice shelves, including Amazon Sea, Ross Sea, and the Price Bay. And the third is differences in chemical weathering of source region. And the fourth is simple conclusions. We know that the ice melt is increasing in recent years, in particular the West Antarctic. So the large melting rate of ice shelves may enhance the sedimentary flow in West Antarctic, and this figure shows the differences of the bedrocks in ages, and it shows that the West Antarctic in generally is younger than the East Antarctic. So this figure shows the case studies currently around Arctic about the outcrops and the differences in the isotopic composition around Antarctic. For example, for the neodymium isotopic composition, the West Antarctic are characterized by positive values, and the East Antarctic are characterized by negative values. These two figures show the ice flow direction in Antarctic, and the right two figures show the oceanic currents around the Antarctic. We can see that the coast currents are widely distributed around Antarctic, and this figure shows the sediment transport in the ice front, in the ice shelf front, in the front end of ice shelves, including the melt, water, and iceberg transportation. While we study the clay minerals, we know that clay minerals are important product of chemical weathering, and they are the finest silicate mineral in superficial environment. And this figure shows the transport way from the source region to the marginal seas and deep ocean. So the sediments in the ocean system contains important information of source region. And yeah, it is important to understand the environment and climate in the source region. In our study, we presented the results on the elemental composition as well as the strontium and the neodymium isotopic composition of clay size, fraction, and bedrocks in order to trace their provenance. We also present the results on the elemental composition of bulk samples, and the samples have been treated by the Stokes law to separate the clay size fraction. And other samples have been collected by the Chinese icebreaker Xiulong, and other chemical processes have been measured in Shanghai. This is our lab inside. Yeah. This is the location of our sample, Ross Sea, Price Bay, and Amazon Sea. Noting that we just have 3 clay-sized samples in Amazon Sea, so we are planning to add more samples in the future studies. And yeah, this is the geological background of the three regions. This is our result, including the elemental and isotopic composition. For the element, bulk Amazon Sea sediments show lower UCC normalized elemental composition than the other region. In contrast, clay side sediments show higher concentrations than the other region. And for the strontium and neodymium isotopic composition, they distinguished the samples in all three regions, and showing that Amazon Sea has the highest epsilon neodymium isotopic composition and the lowest strontium isotopic ratios. The three samples in Amazon Sea show distinct chemical composition, and for the neodymium isotopic composition, this side, the A2O2 side, the side is here, and we can see that the values of epsilon neodymium is very close to the coastal region. So we think it may be largely influenced by the gravitational current, and this also have been reported by the previous study. And the other samples show the negative values of epsilon neodymium isotopic composition. So we think they may be possibly from east part of Amazon Sea, and largely influenced by the coastal currents, because the epsilon neodymium is very close to the east part of Amazon Sea. And for the Ross Sea, at the previous studies, and the sediments in the Ross Sea is from both west and east and Arctic, and our data also show these features. However, with an exception, the three samples are different from the other ones. This is the transect, and the three samples located at the west of the transect are and very close to the ice storm. We think the whole area of the sediment is mainly transported by the bottom current and the iceberg transport. Because of the blocking by the ice storm, and the three sides may be lack of the contribution from the iceberg. So they show different geochemical compositions from the other samples. For the price bay, there is a significant increasing trend for the epsilon neodymium, and the west side sample is very close to Gambunting Mountain and the North Prince Charles Mountain, and the east sample is very close to the east coastal regions of Price Bay. And this arrow shows the transport direction of sediment. We think the Price Bay is a semi-closed sea compared with open West Amazon Sea. So we think the effects from coastal current may be limited, and the proximal provenance of clay-side sediment is more pronounced. The samples have also been treated by sequential leaching experiment by acid to remove the carbonates and oxides. And this is the leaching experiment result. We can see that the isotopic composition is different before and after leaching. We use the residual fraction to investigate the chemical weathering in the three regions. And the lithium and the magnesium isotopic composition show negative correlation. And the Amazon Sea show the higher mechanism isotopic composition than the other two regions, and correspondingly, the absences show the lower lithium isotopic composition than Price B and most of Ross C. As we all know, the magnesium isotopic and the CIA have good positive correlation, and the higher values indicate stronger chemical weathering, and the calcite sediment in Amundsen Sea presents a higher magnesium isotopic composition than the other two regions, possibly reflects stronger chemical weathering in West Antarctic than East Antarctic. Correspondingly, the lithium isotopic composition present negative correlation with CIA, and higher CIA correlated to the lower lithium isotopic composition. Yeah, this is our simple conclusion. The first is the calcite sediments vary regularly with geographic position and show local and proximal provenance. And the second is more intensive chemical weathering may have occurred in West Antarctic than the East Antarctic. Frankly, these are our preliminary conclusions, and more case studies are needed in the future. Thanks for your attention. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that talk. It was very interesting. We're going to keep on with our schedule. So if you could stop sharing your screen, please.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to move on to Jay Das, who's with the Space Application Center in India, and they'll be discussing alarming rates of disintegration processes along the Prince Harold Coast and Shiraz Glacier in East Antarctica. So Jay, you can start sharing your screen when you're ready.
Okay, am I audible?
Sorry, what?
Am I audible? And can you see the screen?
I can see it, yes.
Okay, okay. So thank you, Ska, for this privilege. And just a minute, why I'm not able to share. Okay, my topic will be alarming rate of disintegration processes along the Prince Harold Coast and Shiraz Glacier. So myself, Das Jay Sapan, PhD scholar at Gujarat University, and I'll be starting with this. My table of content, introduction and objective study area methodology, results and discussion. So like in introduction, Antarctica is the white continent and coldest of all. So it contains most of the freshwater resources, and it has been noted by several other authors in past that there has been a strong loss of mass from mid 1990s, and between 1992 to 2017, the mass loss from the Antarctic ice sheet has increased the sea level. So as calving from ice shelf in one of the key mechanism by which Antarctica mass loss occurs. So the mass loss due to calving is a fundamental mass balance component that needs to be accurately quantified. So in this figure, we can see that, okay, my study area is somewhere here, this Prince Harold Coast and Shiraz Glacier. So here, this figure shows that how this lines shows the calving and melting. So in this area, most of the mass loss is due to calving events, not due to, and much less due to melting. So we want to study. So why we need to study this disintegration and calving events? Because the amount of disintegration provides the information of instability in that areas. Further disintegration of this ice shelves or tide glacier promotes more calving events in future, because it makes way for the ice to flow in line. So my objectives for this study was to understand the feeding mechanism of icebergs observed in the ship navigation route from Bharti Research Station, which is an Indian research station at Antarctica near MV Ice Shelf, to Maitri Research Station, as those icebergs can create critical damages. So, and also mapping the margin change of that area, then study the minor and major calving events, as well as these calving events also adds as a parameter in ice flow dynamics mechanism. So, just a briefing about my study area. I have chosen these two parts, that Prince Harald Coast and Shiraz Glacier. So here I have did so just to confine our study area, so that our things can become little more easier. That we have made one ROI. This red color polygon, we can see a ROI region. So we have selected that particular ROI region, and why only that area? Because in that area, the iceberg stays for the longer time. Then, as it moves outside that boundary, then it is carried away by the ocean currents. And our data sets were Sentinel-1 data sets from 2015 to 2022. All suitable data sets were acquired and processed. Then one radar set mosaic was also used, which is available for 1997. And so this is my methodology flowchart. So all the Sentinel-1 data sets were taken through all these pre-processing steps. Like here you can say that EW and IW GRD data sets were processed as per standard this all apply orbit file, then calibration speckle filtering, then conversion to DB. From there we went to visual monitoring first to identify the suitable images which identify the time of major calving events. Then we also mapped the margin change. Okay, so we have also we also made velocity maps over Shiraz Glacier. Then just to check that how that area can we derive something out of the phase information for that particular area. So just we also tried DINSAR on that area. Then we went for K-mean clustering to identify the disintegration amount and the area change. So K-mean clustering, in that our major focus was on the ice part. So ice part mainly here we are considering only the ice shelf and icebergs. So it was given 1, and rest sea ice and open ocean, they were assigned 0. So from that one, like 1 shows the ice part, and we have calculated area of that part. So then thresholding, and after polygonizing them, area estimation and parameters. So I'll discuss this on later part. And then results. And so with that results and discussion, first was the margin change analysis. So from 1997 to 2015, Prince Harald Coast noted an advancement of approx 10 kilometers, whereas Shiraz Glacier was 21 kilometers. But from 2015 to 16, it has retreat. Prince Harald Coast got retreated with 5 kilometers on an average running through the coastal front. This is mainly due to major calving events, and at some places 22 kilometers of retreat was also noted. Shiraz Glacier did not show any significant change between that time period, but over our observation from 1997 to 2015, it shows that Prince Harald Coast had advanced into the ocean, but no significant calving took place till 2015. But after 2015, it has been the calving events took place at an alarming rate, and whereas whereas this Shiraz Glacier, 21 kilometers was observed with the increase in the width of the floating part of the glacier. So here we studied the velocity of Shiraz Glacier, that with the that with time there is increase in the length of the glacier, but is there any increase in the velocity pattern of the glacier through from the starting point of the glacier to the grounding point? Just in that case, we found some significant change that 2015, this Shiraz glacier, it has an average velocity of 6.5 meters per day, but in 2020, the average velocity came up to 7 meters per day. And also that the velocity of as we move towards the grounding line of the Shiraz glacier, the velocity before was 5 meters per day, but now it is 6.8 to 7 meters per day in 2020. So it has increased, the pattern of velocity over that glacier has increased, and it also shows that that there is a like the width of the glacier has also flattened out, increased little. So by visual monitoring, visual monitoring, we went through all the images visually to find out the best suitable image which we can feed into the k-mean cluster algorithm and for further classification. So here we wanted to select only those images where major calving events took place. So from 2015 onwards, so Sentinel-1 2015 image, you can see that then 2016 there was iceberg this part was totally detached from this part. So then here also 2016 there was major loss caused to this Prince Herald Coast, and further we are monitoring this disintegration. So iceberg was detached from this part, but it also gave birth to new icebergs and some small and many disintegrated parts. So this particular purple circle shows that. And whereas Shiraz Glacier major loss was in 2017, where it lost nearly 150 square kilometer of its area. So these are we wanted to quantify the velocity and understand how we can use the phase information. But as due to tidal waves and high velocity, so it is having a vertical displacement as well as horizontal displacement at a greater pace. So D inside is suitable for slow moving regions mainly. So we couldn't get, so there was complete decorrelation, and we couldn't get some fringes over that area. But after identifying the suitable images from visual interpretation, we went to we fed it to the k-mean cluster, where our main objective was to identify all the ice regions which contains ice shelf and icebergs, and also the glacier part. So here you can see that all these icebergs are icebergs as well as ice shelf is surrounded by these blue polygons. It shows that how our algorithm has identified these features, and this particular graph on the right side, it shows so we have done one ratio perimeter by area. The corresponding colors corresponds to these years. So as we move from in this x-axis, as we move from 0 to this 0.10, so this shows the size of the fragmentation. So we can see that there are more number of fragments in the more number of fragments are present in the small size, like below 0.05. Sorry, are below this. So this area shows that there are more number of smaller fragments, and these are number of fragments, and there are very few large fragments are there. And this is example. This is again a comparison between between area change. So area. This right side graph shows the area which we have found out using k-mean cluster and thresholding. So for each image, different threshold was found out using that k-mean cluster, k-mean algorithm. And this particular graph shows the area versus dates. And here we can see the ratio. Here we have taken p square by a, so that we can identify the disintegrated areas. Like so here we can see that in 2016 to 17, the disintegrated area, the disintegration, the number of icebergs were more, like small fragments were high, but still it has a low area. So here we can say that our ratio has worked efficiently to find out the number of fragments in that zone. So our main our main objective was to find out the number of fragmentations, or to find out the disintegrated areas. So here then 2020 also 2020, you can see that the fragmentation were not so much, and then 2021, but the area was low. Okay, and so these are I conclude here, and these are my references. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Jay. If you can stop sharing your screen, we'll take any questions for Jay in the Q&A box, and we'll answer those questions live at the end of the session. First, before Stefan starts, I just want to see if Dehanendra Singh is here in the session anywhere. So if you are, you can just send me maybe a private message, and we're gonna move on to Stefan Velez, who's at Sofia University in Bulgaria. They will be talking about tephra layers in the Peronica Glacier, Livingston Island, Antarctica.
Okay. I hope that you can see my screen and you can hear my voice. Okay.
Good.
Hello to everybody. I'm very happy to have a chance to present from this audience the following study, the tephra layers in Peronica Glacier, Livingston Island, South Shetland Islands, Antarctica. In recent research, we will present from one hand field information about the tephra layers, and from the other hand the phase data about the phase composition of the tephra layers based on X-ray diffraction analysis. Livingston is the second largest island of the. Yep. Yes.
So right now we're looking at your PowerPoint slide deck view. Do you have this in presenter view? Because we're not seeing that.
Okay.
Okay, do you see the little presenter view on the bottom right-hand screen? Right by the where you can change the size of it. If you could just, yep, right there.
Okay, now.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, that's perfect, thank you.
Sorry for this technical problem, but it's part of the online communications and the presentations. So the Livingston Island is the second largest island of the South Shetland Islands, which are separated from the Antarctic Peninsula by the Bransfield Strait. More than 90, maybe more than 95% of the island is covered by glaciers. and is encircled by 30 to 70 meters high ice cliffs. Many of the ice cliffs contain dark layers of unconsolidated ash called tephra. The ice and tephra stratigraphy seen in the ice cliffs is a result of deposition within the accumulation zone in the interior of the island and in the glacier. The distortion of the tephra layers during glacial transport and ablation may result in a different local tephra stratigraphy. The distinctive grouping and spacing of the multiple tephra layers is repeated at many localities in the glaciers on the island. There are evidences based on literature data that more of the tephra layers, some of the tephra layers, were sourced from Deception Island. Deception Island is an active volcano situated in a Bransfield Strait, about 25 kilometers south of Livingston Island. Peronica Glacier is situated in the eastern part of the Livingston Island and north of the Bulgarian Antarctic base. The glacier is about, this is the glacier. The glacier is about 8 kilometer length and 3 kilometer width. In the cliff of Peronica Glacier, there are about 10, you can see the layers in this photo, in this cliff. There are about 10 different tephra intervals, different tephra layers. The lowest of them are inaccessible because it's too dangerous to take samples from there. The uppermost 7 of the tephra layers was observed during the 26th Bulgarian Antarctic expedition. The lower 6 levels from TPH1 to TPH6 are located at relatively equal intervals and have thicknesses about 3 to 5 centimeters. The layer TPH7, this is the uppermost layer, is situated about 10 meters above the TPH6 layer and is 10 to 12 centimeter thick. All tephra layers macroscopically consist of predominantly black and subordinately of red pumiceous particles, volcanic particles. In this research, for the first time is shown data about the phase, about the mineral composition of the tephra layers from this glacier. Other X-ray diffractometric assay shows uniform phase composition of the crystal component. Plagioclase between 34 and 47%, and pyroxene between 7 to 10%. Diffraction lines analysis defines 2 types of plagioclase, anorthite and sodium anorthite. Comparison between registered diffraction lines and different pyroxene types from the reference database identifies pyroxenes from all samples as ferrium diopside. A small amount of quartz is also present in the composition of the layers of the tephras. The phase composition corresponds with basalts and basaltic andesite from the published data on chemical content of the tephroid levels by Pala et al. In 3 of the levels was discovered andaluzite and about 2 and 6%, and mica about 5 and 7%. Due to the low mica content in the samples, it is difficult to determine the actual type of the mica minerals. Probably is sericitic type or biotite. Actually, andesite and micas are xenocrysts are not typical for this kind of materials, for this kind of products. And considering their metamorphic genesis, because these minerals have metamorphic genesis, not igneous, not volcanic genesis, the most reasonable source is the metamorphic basement, the metamorphic fundament of this part of Antarctica. Some conclusion remarks: sample TPH 2, 3, 4, and 6 correspond with basalt and basaltic andesite from the published data. And this is the normal situation. And maybe their source is Deception Island. Samples TPH 1, 5, and 7 are different and are one surprising discovery. I talk about this, about their eventually genesis, what they are doing in this tephroid levels. When we talk about the future works, this include sampling tephra materials from other locations and more, not just XRD, X-ray diffraction analysis, and different kind of chemical analysis for a more detailed conclusions and data about this interesting tephra layers, not just in this case, and many localities in Livingston Island. So thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much for that talk. This concludes our speaker portion of the session. We'll be spending the next about 10 minutes answering some questions. Since you're already unmuted though, Stefan, I think Barry had a question for you.
Yes, Stefan, that was a great talk. When you say you're going to take more samples, are you going to take them on Livingston Island, or you're going to spread out geographically and maybe look at there's a glacier on a number of those. There's glaciers on numbers of those of the Shetlands, right?
Yes, and
So,
our work is based on samples just from one localities.
I see.
We hope that in the future we will have a chance to visit Antarctica again. Everybody wants to visit Antarctica again and again, and to take samples from more localities to correspond different levels.
Okay. Are you able to age date the tephra by argon or some other technique? Have you thought about that?
Yes, it will be interesting, and it will give more information and something very important. If we have the absolutely age of the levels, we will have a chance to correspond with the eruptions of Deception Island more accurately.
Thank you very much. It's a great talk.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You actually have one more question from Damien in the Q&A. He says, thanks for an interesting and beautifully illustrated presentation. You mentioned a possible metamorphic basement component to some of the tephra. Would you expect more quartz in those samples if that were the case?
Okay. Thank you to Damian to this good question. In our samples, the quartz is very low, but we are not sure that the quartz is really exist in these samples because there is a very low concentration. Maybe the other analysis which we will do it with these samples will fix if there is actually exist quartz or no. Yes, but if there is some xenocrysts and some xenomaterials from the basement, maybe, and the quartz will be more higher in the concentration. So I hope that the answer is good.
Thank you. We're going to move on to a couple of questions for Barry. The first is from Damien again in the Q&A. He says, really interesting work on weathering. Would mineralogical analyses of dirty subglacial carbonates help to understand which zeolites, for example, might form during freezing of solute-rich meltwater?
Well, Damien, that's a good question. That's kind of out of my knowledge. I'm not very knowledgeable about the zeolites, so I would think that that would be an interesting place to look, because I think the only issue is at least my understanding is the formation of zeolites require a relatively high pH, and given what I know about the chemistry of ice, unless it had a lot of carbonate or dust material in it, the pHs would be relatively low in order to form zeolites. But maybe in these dusty layers with a lot of carbonate in them, you might find zeolite formation. So I think that's an excellent question that I don't really have a good answer for.
We have a second question for you, Barry, from Dan. Is the hyperrig zone salty at all? Is there a role that brines play in this weathering?
That's a great question, Dan. And the answer is, I think, sometimes. And what I mean by that is it really depends on the flow. At the end of the flow season, at the end of, as you get into February, and at least in Taylor Valley, and the flows decrease, that hyperrheic zone picture I showed you, where you're looking down at the wetted areas around the channels, get very crusted with salt. So you're looking at a capillary evaporation probably of water up through that really porous sediment. And you are undoubtedly forming brines in high enough concentrations where you're up precipitating salt. But if you were to come back the next year, once you start to see high flows again, a lot of that salt dissolves. So it really is a timing thing, and it probably varies greatly from time of year to time of year and location within the hyperrheic zone.
Great, thanks, Barry. So we have a couple more questions, it seems like, in the chat from Dan. This next one is for Haben. Dan says this may not be a very good question. I'm sure it is. But I was wondering if there's any input of clay-sized material from the winds, or is it all glacially derived? Would wind-blown material have a different provenance signature?
Yes, a very good question. Yes, thanks, Dan. I think I also collected the data about the dust from the literature, and found that at least the new DML isotopic composition is largely different from our data. So we think the contribution from the dust is very limited for the clay-sized sediments. So we think most of them are glacially derived, and based on the literature, we find that the major contribution for Antarctic is mainly from the South America. So the nucleum isotopic, at least the nucleum isotopic composition, and also the mineral elemental ratio is different from our data. Yeah. Okay. We can keep in touch for a deeper discussion. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions for Jay. The first is from Dan again in the chat. Were you able to see an increase in velocity after large calving events?
Okay, after large calving events, like theoretically, there should be increase in velocity, because it creates a space for the ice flow from behind. but due to some constraint, we took velocity. We did our velocity process after 2 years of calving events, and yes, there was an increase in velocity, but just suddenly after the calving events, it should be there. But unfortunately, we didn't do that part. We conducted the process after 2 years of that event. So, yes, there will be increase in calving. Increase in velocity after calving events. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jay. And your second question is actually from Barry, so he's going to ask it live.
Jay, I enjoyed your talk. Very nice presentation. I'm wondering if this is ongoing research. Do you and your group plan to continue to do the monitoring of these glaciers in the future?
Yes, sir. Yes. Yes, sir. We are. This is an ongoing process, and we are trying to improve it further with some good algorithms also. Like we have just for fresher, like just for start, we have doing this K-mean cluster. Then we'll move to some better algorithms, so we can monitor them regularly. Because this disintegration events, it creates it is very vulnerable for ships, those who are taking cargoes over there. So our main focus is to identify those icebergs and also those small like disintegrations. So yes, we will be continuing this further, and soon we'll get one paper out of it. So yes.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. We have one last question. It's actually for Stefan again. And I'm going to tag team your question a little bit, Dan. So Dan asks, what do you need to know to determine the source of these tougher layers? So Stefan, you mentioned in your talk that you believe most of these layers are coming from the nearby Deception Island. Is there a plausible alternative source?
Okay, I try to answer to Dan in the chat, but there is a clear evidence that the uppermost layer, TPH7, is from the eruption of Deception Island, because and maybe from the last eruption during 1970-71. The problem are the levels under this level, because there is no data about the eruptions before this year in the Deception Island. Maybe they are with different source. Maybe. I hope that a more detailed chemical analysis will separate it more clearly based on the chemical components, the distinctive layers. In the future.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks everyone for asking great questions. Thanks again to our presenters for taking time out of your day to share your awesome research with us. I just want to remind everyone that that this is a parallel session, and we do have e-lightning posters that are live throughout the duration of the conference. And I believe that some of our speakers actually have posters as well. So I invite you to continue discussions there virtually. And if you have any questions, please reach out to the presenters with those questions.
Yeah, I too want to add my thanks to the speakers. It was a really diverse and interesting session. And some of you are, as you know, the whole time span of the globe. So I know I speak for Melisa too, in thanking you and wishing you either a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good night. And we hope to meet face-to-face at the next Open Science SCAR meeting in 2 years. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thanks, Barry and Melisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for everything, and to wish to see you face and face somewhere, maybe in Antarctic. I don't know. Thank
Okay.
you.
That'd
Bye,
be
guys.
great. Bye.
Bye, everybody.